February 19th, 1945, Iwo Jima. The black volcanic sands shake under the thunder of naval guns. Battleships anchored offshore hurl shells the size of oil drums into a speck of rock no longer than 8 miles across. The island trembles, yet nothing moves. No soldiers, no return fire, only smoke, wind, and the eerie silence of a place waiting to kill. Then the first wave of U.S. Marines steps ashore. Their boots sink into soft ash, weapons gripped tight. Within minutes, the silence ends. Bullets hiss from nowhere. Mortar rounds explode behind them. The air fills with invisible death. They cannot see the enemy. Only flashes from the mouth of tunnels hidden deep in the rock. Every crater, every shadow could be a bunker. Rifle fire vanishes into the hillside, swallowed by the earth. Pinned down, Marines crawl forward through sulfur fumes and burning sand. Grenades fail. Bullets can't reach what hides beneath. Somewhere along the front line, a corporal straps a 70-pound tank to his back. A flamethrower. The weapon hums like a furnace as he pulls the trigger. Fire pours into the dark. Screams echo from beneath the ground. What began as an invasion has become a battle fought underground. And fire is the only language left. By early 1945, the war in the Pacific had reached its final and most brutal stage. Japan's vast empire had shrunk to a chain of islands stretching back toward its homeland. One by one, those islands had been taken. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, each costing thousands of American lives. Yet one small volcanic island, barely visible on a map, would become one of the bloodiest battles of the war. Iwo Jima. The island sat halfway between the Mariana Islands and Tokyo, only 750 miles from Japan itself. For the U.S. Army Air Forces, it was priceless. From the Marianas, B-29 superfortresses were striking the Japanese mainland, but many never made it home. Engine failures, fuel shortages, and fighter attacks sent crippled bombers into the Pacific by the dozens. A base on Iwo Jima meant emergency landings, fighter escorts, and a launch point for the final assault on Japan. For the Japanese, that meant Iwo Jima could never fall. Defending the island was Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, a brilliant and disciplined commander who understood what was coming. He knew he could not stop the American Navy or match its air power. Instead, he turned Iwo Jima into a fortress designed to bleed the U.S. Marines dry. Kuribayashi rejected the old doctrine of banzai charges and suicidal surface defense. He ordered his 21,000 men to dig in. Deep. Over the course of months, Japanese engineers carved an underground city. 16 miles of tunnels, bunkers, and command posts buried within volcanic rock. They connected artillery positions, hospitals, and barracks beneath layers of earth and concrete. Above ground, the island looked deserted. Just black sand, scattered rocks, and a towering volcano at its southern tip. Mount Suribachi. But beneath that surface lay hundreds of concealed firing ports and reinforced strongpoints. Every inch of the island was pre-sighted for crossfire. Every Marine who landed would walk into a pre-measured kill zone. The Americans knew Iwo Jima would be difficult, but not this difficult. Intelligence estimated a garrison of 13,000 defenders, almost half the real number. They believed the naval bombardment would neutralize most resistance. By D-Day, the U.S. Navy had fired over 6,800 tons of shells, and aircraft had dropped thousands of bombs. Many officers believed nothing could survive that. But Kuribayashi's men were waiting, safe beneath the ground. When the Marines of the 4th and 5th Divisions came ashore on the morning of February 19th, 1945, they found no opposition, until they advanced far enough for the hidden guns to open fire all at once. Within minutes, the beaches became a killing ground. The fine volcanic ash offered no cover, no traction, and no mercy. Tanks bogged down, bulldozers sank. Medics dragged the wounded through burning sand. Every shell burst flung more dust into the air, choking men as they tried to return fire against an enemy they couldn't see. Iwo Jima was unlike any battle before it. Not jungle, not city, but a labyrinth of invisible defenses. The Japanese strategy was to let the Marines come close, then destroy them from underground. Kuribayashi wanted to make the Americans pay 10 lives for every yard gained. For the men pinned down on the beach, the situation was clear. Rifles and grenades wouldn't win this fight. Something else, something more devastating, would be needed to flush the enemy from the tunnels. Below, Operation Detachment, the code name for the invasion of Iwo Jima, had been approved in late 1944. The plan seemed simple on paper. Capture the island in about a week. With 3 Marine divisions, massive naval support, and total air superiority, American commanders believed their combined firepower could overwhelm any defense. But Iwo Jima was no ordinary island. It was a volcanic fortress, the result of millennia of eruptions that created soft, ash-like soil and jagged rock ridges. Every step a Marine took sank inches into black sand that swallowed boots and offered no shelter. There were no trees, no grass, no trenches, just endless open ground under constant fire. The invasion fleet that gathered off Iwo Jima was one of the largest in the Pacific War. Over 450 ships, including battleships, cruisers, and aircraft carriers. On February 16th, the bombardment began. For 3 days and nights, the island was pounded with shells, rockets, and napalm. Observers described it as a landscape boiling with explosions. But deep inside their tunnels, Japanese soldiers waited, untouched. Kuribayashi's genius lay in patience. He forbade his men from firing a single shot during the shelling. He wanted the Marines to think the island was dead, to draw them closer. His defense map divided the island into hundreds of interlocking zones, each commanded by small units trained to fight independently, even if cut off. There would be no counterattacks, no retreats. Every man would die where he stood. The Marines who landed on D-Day faced a new kind of warfare. When the first waves reached the beach, there was no enemy in sight. For an hour, they pushed forward, setting up supply lines and marking the landing zones. Then, almost simultaneously, more than 700 hidden guns, mortars, and machine guns opened fire. It was like the island itself had come alive. Entire platoons were wiped out in seconds. Radio operators tried to call for support, but static and smoke filled the air. Commanders on the beach couldn't tell where the fire was coming from. Every ridge and hill concealed multiple firing points, each connected to the next through invisible tunnels. Marine tanks rolled forward to silence the guns, but most became trapped in the soft ash or destroyed by mines. Artillery support from the ships offshore was nearly useless. The enemy was too well hidden. As one Marine put it, "You couldn't tell if you were killing anyone at all. You just kept shooting at holes in the ground." It was the beginning of 36 days of relentless, grinding combat. Every position had to be taken by hand. Bunker by bunker, tunnel by tunnel. The Japanese would disappear underground during bombardments, only to reappear behind advancing units, cutting them off and forcing brutal close-quarters fighting. The flamethrower, once a rarely used weapon, suddenly became essential. For the first time, it wasn't just a tool, it was a survival weapon. Marines learned that the only way to neutralize a tunnel was to fill it with fire and collapse it. But even that was dangerous work. Flamethrower operators carried tanks of pressurized fuel on their backs. A single bullet could turn them into human torches. By the end of the first week, the Marines had realized that conventional tactics wouldn't work. Kuribayashi's underground network had to be burned out, one chamber at a time. The battle that began as an amphibious landing was becoming something else entirely. A subterranean war fought in darkness, smoke and flame. For the Marines on Iwo Jima, the battle quickly became personal. Not just a mission, but a test of endurance and sanity. There were no front lines, no safe zones, and no place to rest. Every crater might hide an enemy. Every night, Japanese soldiers crept through hidden tunnels, emerging behind American positions to kill and vanish again. Men began to describe the island as alive. It breathed smoke, heat, and the constant stench of sulfur. The air burned their lungs. The sand scorched their skin. Even the wounded found no peace. Medics worked under fire, dragging men through ash that clung like tar. The Marines faced an enemy they almost never saw. The Japanese had transformed the landscape into a three-dimensional battlefield, using tunnels to appear where no one expected them. Kuribayashi's troops rarely surrendered. They fought silently and precisely, conserving ammunition, waiting for moments of weakness. For the Marines, it was like fighting ghosts. Rifle fire and grenades couldn't reach soldiers hidden behind layers of rock. Flamethrowers, demolition charges, and tank-mounted guns became the only effective response. Small assault teams, usually 5 or 6 men, would crawl forward under cover fire, locate an opening, and unleash fire or explosives into the darkness. Each of these attacks demanded coordination and courage. Flamethrower operators were prime targets. Their fuel tanks were vulnerable, and they had to get within yards of enemy positions. Riflemen covered them, engineers followed to seal tunnel entrances, and medics waited behind the line. The teamwork was raw and instinctive. Everyone's survival depended on it. The 4th and 5th Marine Divisions fought side by side, advancing just a few hundred yards each day. Commanders realized that progress could only be measured in destroyed bunkers, not in ground gained. The Japanese fought to the last man in nearly every strong point. At times, flamethrower teams had to burn the same position multiple times. The enemy would retreat deeper underground and re-emerge through another exit, still firing. Marines began using a brutal but effective tactic. Once a tunnel was cleared, engineers packed the entrance with explosives and sealed it shut. Reports from the front describe moments of near madness. In one day of fighting, some units lost half their strength for a few hundred yards of sand. Men fought without sleep, covered in ash and grime. Their faces darkened until they blended with the terrain itself. Despite the horror, discipline held. Leadership at the squad level made the difference. Non-commissioned officers, often in their 20s, led men through chaos, adapting tactics on the spot. The Marines' doctrine of flexibility, every man a rifleman, proved vital. When communications failed, initiative and trust replaced orders. Amid this, the bond between Marines grew stronger than fear. Flamethrower teams were often protected like brothers. Riflemen would shield them with their bodies, knowing the success of an entire attack might rest on that one man with the tank on his back. As one Marine later said, "You didn't think about dying. You thought about not letting the guy next to you die." By the second week, the battlefield had changed shape. What started as an invasion across open beaches had turned into a maze of fire-scarred ridges and collapsed tunnels. The Marines had adapted. They were learning how to fight underground. War often accelerates innovation, and nowhere was that clearer than on Iwo Jima. The island's defenses forced the U.S. Marines to adapt faster than ever before. Weapons that had been considered secondary or experimental suddenly became essential to survival. The most iconic among them was the M2A1 flamethrower, a 70-pound weapon fueled by a mixture of gasoline and thickened napalm, capable of projecting a stream of fire nearly 40 yards. Before Iwo Jima, it was used sparingly in the Pacific, mostly to clear pillboxes or trenches. On this island, it became the weapon of decision. Flamethrowers could do what rifles and grenades couldn't: reach into the earth. The tunnels and bunkers that protected Kuribayashi's men were too deep for artillery and too narrow for tanks. But a jet of fire could travel around corners, burn oxygen, and drive defenders out or kill them where they hid. It was horrific, but effective. And for Marines pinned down by unseen enemies, it was the only answer. The U.S. Army Chemical Warfare Service worked closely with the Marines to modify equipment for the unique terrain. They developed flame tanks, Sherman tanks fitted with flamethrowers instead of standard guns. Known as the POA CWS-H1, these vehicles carried enough fuel to incinerate entire cave systems. The Japanese soon learned to fear their distinctive low roar and the fire arcs that followed. Engineers also adapted explosives to the terrain. Satchel charges, bundles of TNT packed into canvas bags, were used to collapse tunnels after they were cleared. Combat engineers followed behind flamethrower teams, sealing exits with explosives or bulldozing them under volcanic ash. The strategy was methodical and slow, but it began to work. Still, every technological gain came with risk. Flamethrower operators were among the most dangerous roles in the Pacific War. They carried volatile fuel and became immediate targets for snipers and machine gunners. Many never survived their first mission. The Marines who took up the weapon often did so voluntarily, knowing what it meant. Tank crews, too, faced constant danger. The rough terrain and hidden mines made movement unpredictable. The volcanic ash clogged engines, jammed treads, and made even minor repairs deadly under fire. Yet despite the risks, innovation continued in the field. Mechanics and engineers improvised on the spot, rerouting fuel lines, extending hoses, and modifying triggers for faster bursts. It wasn't just about technology, it was about ingenuity. Marines used bulldozers to create improvised cover, dragged flamethrower tanks through mud with steel cables, and coordinated attacks between infantry and armor like never before. The combined assault, fire, explosives, and close-quarters combat became the grim rhythm of Iwo Jima. Even the Japanese defenders, though doomed, recognized the technological superiority of their enemy. Captured diaries and letters later revealed shock at the sheer persistence of American engineering. The way tanks returned after being hit, the constant resupply of fuel and ammunition, and the coordination between air, sea, and ground units. Kuribayashi's fortress, once thought impenetrable, was slowly being undone not just by numbers, but by adaptation. Every weapon, vehicle, and machine was repurposed to fit the unforgiving landscape. The Americans weren't simply overpowering Iwo Jima, they were learning from it in real time. As the battle dragged into its third week, that evolution reached its peak. The Marines had mastered the island's dark geometry, and the unthinkable weapon that had once been a last resort was now leading the way. By the third week of the invasion, Iwo Jima had become a graveyard of machines and men. The beaches were littered with burned-out tanks, twisted landing craft, and the blackened remains of bunkers that once defied artillery. Yet, even as the Marines pushed forward, the resistance only intensified. The Japanese garrison had withdrawn into the island's northern ridges and the slopes of Mount Suribachi, where the tunnels grew deeper and the defenses more complex. Mount Suribachi was the key, a volcanic cone that dominated the southern end of the island. From its summit, Japanese observers could direct artillery with deadly precision. Every movement on the beaches below was visible. The 28th Marine Regiment was given the task of taking it. The approach was brutal. Marines advanced just a few yards at a time, blasted by machine gun nests hidden in caves and trenches that seemed endless. The smell of sulfur and cordite hung in the air. The ground shook with explosions, sending clouds of ash into the sunlight. Each attack required flamethrowers and demolition teams working together in silence, communicating through hand signals as they crawled toward their targets. The flamethrower became the spearhead of the assault. Operators like Private Herschel Woody Williams, who would later receive the Medal of Honor, crawled forward alone, his back heavy with fuel, his hands trembling against the metal wand that held life and death in equal measure. He aimed jets of fire into cave mouths, holding the stream until the heat melted the rock itself. Williams and others like him cleared one position after another, their teams sealing the tunnels behind them with charges. The air grew hotter, thicker, impossible to breathe. Yet they kept moving. Every cave cleared meant one less gun firing at the men below. On February 23, 1945, after days of relentless fighting, Marines reached the summit of Mount Suribachi. They planted a small American flag on a steel pipe, visible from the beaches below. For the first time since D-Day, men cheered openly. Ships offshore sounded their horns. It was a moment of triumph, and a signal that the southern half of Iwo Jima had finally fallen. But for many Marines, victory came with unease. The tunnels beneath Suribachi were still filled with bodies, smoke, and silence. The mountain had been burned from the inside out. The unthinkable, and using fire to cleanse the earth of hidden enemies, had become the new normal. The flag atop Suribachi was soon replaced by a larger one, the one immortalized in Joe Rosenthal's famous photograph. That image would become a symbol of courage and sacrifice, yet the battle was far from over. To the north, Kuribayashi's remaining troops still held fortified ridges and ravines in a final, desperate stand. The Marines had taken the island's most visible objective, but not its heart. The next phase would be the most punishing of all. Fighting into the depths of the Japanese stronghold, where fire and darkness became indistinguishable. The fall of Mount Suribachi did not end the battle. It merely marked the halfway point in what would become one of the bloodiest engagements in U.S. Marine Corps history. The northern half of Iwo Jima was even worse. The terrain there was a maze of ridges and cliffs: Motoyama Plateau, Nishi Ridge, Turkey Knob, and the amphitheater, all fortified beyond imagination. General Kuribayashi had ordered his men to dig deep and fight to the death. His command posts were buried beneath 30 to 50 feet of rock. Some caves were so deep that even naval bombardment couldn't reach them. Marines quickly realized they were fighting ghosts. The Japanese didn't retreat. They simply vanished underground, only to reappear behind American lines. Flamethrower teams and demolition squads became indispensable. Every attack began with tanks fitted with flamethrowers, known as Ronson tanks or M4A3R3 Shermans, named for the cigarette lighter that always lights the first time. These tanks rolled forward with Marine riflemen close behind, spewing torrents of fire into the dark holes ahead. The ground itself seemed to ignite. One Marine later recalled, "You couldn't shoot them. You couldn't reach them, so we burned them out." It was brutal, and it was effective. The fire sucked the oxygen out of the tunnels, forcing hidden defenders into the open, where waiting rifles and machine guns ended what the flames began. Still, the cost was staggering. Each yard of ground claimed on Iwo Jima cost lives. The Japanese defenders refused to surrender. Many chose suicide over capture, detonating grenades inside bunkers or charging into the flames. Others played dead until Marines passed by, then attacked from behind. Every cave was a gamble. Every step forward could be the last. By early March, American forces had taken Airfield No. 1 and No. 2, vital objectives that would soon serve as emergency landing strips for crippled B-29 bomb Kursusiter du 4. returning from raids over Japan. But the victory came with a terrible price. Nearly 20,000 Marines wounded or killed in less than 3 weeks. Kuribayashi's final defensive line, a narrow strip at the island's northern tip, held out until March 25, 1945, when the last major counterattack erupted. Around 300 Japanese soldiers charged under the cover of darkness, armed with grenades, bayonets, and desperation. They broke through a rear area of the 5th Marine Division, killing sleeping men and destroying equipment before being wiped out. When dawn came, silence returned to Iwo Jima. The tunnels that had once echoed with shouts and gunfire were now tombs. Out of 21,000 Japanese defenders, only 216 were captured alive. The rest had fought to the end, just as Kuribayashi promised. For the Marines, the battle had redefined what it meant to fight and to survive. Flamethrowers, explosives, and sheer determination had conquered an island that refused to surrender. Yet as the smoke cleared, many could not shake the image of what they had done. Men using fire to fight men hidden in darkness. The island was secured, but the cost was burned into memory, a victory measured not in territory, but in sacrifice. And as the last flamethrowers were turned off, the world began to understand what that victory would mean for the war to come. When the guns finally fell silent on Iwo Jima, the island looked like the surface of another world. The black volcanic sand was churned into ash. Hills had been flattened by bombardment. The air reeked of sulfur and death. The cost was unlike anything the United States had seen before. In just 36 days, nearly 7,000 American Marines were killed and more than 19,000 wounded. The Japanese, true to Kuribayashi's vow, had fought to extinction. Out of roughly 21,000 defenders, almost every man was dead. For the Marines who survived, there was no triumph in what they saw. Iwo Jima was not a prize. It was a graveyard. They had taken 8 square miles of volcanic rock at a price that stunned even hardened commanders. Yet, as days turned into weeks, the true importance of Iwo Jima began to emerge. The island's location, 750 miles south of Tokyo, made it one of the most strategic pieces of land in the Pacific. Before its capture, crippled B-29 bombers returning from raids over Japan often crashed into the sea for lack of a landing strip. Now, Iwo Jima's captured airfields offered a lifeline. Within weeks, Seabees and U.S. Army engineers worked around the clock to repair and extend the runways. Soon, the first B-29 superfortresses began landing on the island. Some shot up, others out of fuel. Over the next few months, more than 2,400 bombers would make emergency landings there, saving tens of thousands of airmen who otherwise would have been lost. Photographs of Marines raising the American flag atop Mount Suribachi, taken by Joe Rosenthal, captured the spirit of what Iwo Jima meant: endurance, unity, and sacrifice. The image would become one of the most iconic in U.S. history, a symbol of a nation that refused to stop fighting. But behind that image were men who would never forget what it took to earn it. Marines who had watched friends vanish into tunnels. Flamethrower operators who carried the weight of what they'd done. Corpsmen who had tried to save lives on soil that burned their hands. One Marine, years later, said quietly, "Iwo wasn't about glory. It was about getting off that beach alive." As the island's role shifted from battlefield to lifeline, its silence returned. Tunnels once alive with gunfire became burial sites. Japanese and American bodies were recovered side by side, sometimes still locked in combat. The Marines built cemeteries along the beach, rows of white crosses against the dark sand, stark reminders of the price of victory. For the United States, Iwo Jima was more than a tactical win. It was proof of resolve, that no obstacle, no enemy fortification, no cost would stop the advance toward Japan. But it also raised an unspoken question. If this was what it took to capture one small island, what would it take to invade the Japanese homeland itself? That question would haunt American planners and lead directly to a decision that would end the war in a way no one could have imagined. In the weeks after Iwo Jima fell, American commanders studied every report that came back from the island. They were alarmed by what they saw. Every square yard of Iwo Jima had been turned into a fortress, and it had taken the best-trained Marines in the world, supported by the heaviest naval bombardment ever conducted, to take it. If Japan's inner islands were defended in the same way, the casualty numbers would be unthinkable. General Holland Smith, the senior Marine commander, estimated that an invasion of Japan might cost up to 1 million American casualties. That realization spread through the U.S. military leadership like a shadow. The victory at Iwo Jima, once seen as a stepping stone, had become a warning. But for the men who fought there, the war was not over. Many would go on to fight again just months later. On Okinawa, another volcanic island even larger and more heavily defended. There, the lessons of Iwo Jima shaped every tactic. The use of flamethrowers, demolition teams, and close coordination with tanks and aircraft. The brutal logic of fire and steel had become standard procedure. Meanwhile, back home, the image of Marines raising the flag on Mount Suribachi traveled across the nation. It was printed in newspapers, shown in newsreels, and even used to drive war bond campaigns that raised hundreds of millions of dollars for the final push toward victory. The photo's power was not just patriotic, it was personal. It showed ordinary men doing something extraordinary in a place few Americans could even pronounce. Yet behind that photograph was the quiet exhaustion of the survivors. Many Marines returned home haunted by the battle. The smell of burned earth, the screams from tunnels, the faces of those who never came back. They had fought an enemy they rarely saw, in conditions few could imagine. For Japan, Iwo Jima was a tragic foretelling. Kuribayashi's strategy had succeeded in inflicting maximum losses, but it could not stop the inevitable. The Imperial Japanese Army had fought with fanatical courage, but America's industrial and logistical might had proven unstoppable. For the first time, the Japanese military began to understand the scale of the force bearing down on them. By the summer of 1945, as U.S. bombers took off from Iwo Jima to strike Tokyo directly, the war was closing in. The very island Japan had fortified so fiercely now served as a launch pad for the planes that would bring fire to their own cities. When the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August, many of those bombers flew from or overflew Iwo Jima. The same ground that had been bought with blood became part of the final act of the war. In retrospect, Iwo Jima was both a victory and a warning, a symbol of courage, but also a glimpse into the unimaginable price of total war. The flamethrowers, the tunnels, the relentless fighting, all of it reflected what happens when neither side is willing to surrender. For the Marines, the lesson was clear. No battle would ever test them the same way again. For the world, Iwo Jima became a testament to the cost of victory, and a reminder that even on a small island of black sand, history can turn red. In the years after the war, Iwo Jima became sacred ground. Veterans who returned there described it as eerily quiet, a place frozen in time. The beaches where thousands had died were smooth again, but the memories were not. For the Marines, Iwo Jima represented the purest form of their creed: duty above self, courage in the face of the impossible. Every man who stepped onto that island knew what it meant to fight when there was nowhere left to hide. Historians would later call it one of the most intense battles of World War II, not for its size, but for its ferocity. The fighting at Iwo Jima was personal, face-to-face, yard by yard, fought not for conquest, but survival. Kuribayashi's defense proved how dangerous a determined enemy could be, but it also proved something else: that American willpower, ingenuity, and unity could overcome even the most fortified positions on Earth. The flamethrowers, the tanks, the logistics, the brotherhood, all came together in one of the most brutal and defining chapters of the Pacific War. When the flag went up on Mount Suribachi, it did more than signal victory. It told the world that the United States would not stop until the war was won, and that even in hellish places, hope could rise. Today, Iwo Jima stands as a symbol not only of sacrifice, but of transformation. The same island once soaked in blood now hosts joint U.S.-Japanese memorials, where former enemies bow in silence side by side. The flames that once destroyed now illuminate remembrance, a reminder that even in the darkest tunnels of war, humanity can still find its way back to the light.